first of all, thank you for accepting the invitation to participate in this webinar. I would like to ask you to quickly introduce yourself. And I will, based on the discussion that we had a couple of days ago with all of you, I'm going to start asking you the questions that were prepared by Thomas. And I'm pretty sure that this discussion is going to grow and is going to be very interesting. So Marjolaine,
great.
Do you want to start? Let's start with the ladies.
So, well, thank you for having me and for inviting me. That's really a good thing for me to be here discussing with you how we can accelerate this renovation wave and surf it together. I like the title. Thank you for that. And I'm an MP. I was elected from an area near Lyon in France, and I am in charge of the building renovation roadmap for the French government, and for the 5 years that I'm elected, I'm supposed to follow up on that and see what's working, what's not working, and yell if we're not on track. I do yell a lot about it. So that's it mostly. I don't know what else you want me to say.
Yes, no, this is great. I think that it's very interesting to have the three of you today with us, because our intention with this webinar is to see how the European level can collaborate better with the national level and the local level. So you, Marjolaine, you are our guest who is representing the national level, and I think would be very interesting to see how you can support each other, and also in the context of we called this webinar the social renovation way for a social European Green Deal. So would be very interesting to see what's the social perspective, the citizens. How are you in your work are considering the needs of the citizens? And this is where also Richard can provide us with some interesting insights. And Karen, you are the superstar rapporteur. So I would invite you to tell us a few words about
Sure.
your work.
No, it's a pleasure, and greetings from a sunny day in Dublin, Ireland. Look, I've been a member of the European Parliament just for the last year, but previously I had been in the National Parliament here in Ireland, and also a councillor for most of the last 30 years. I think the challenge, as you say yourself, is to try and connect the dots locally, nationally, and at a European level. It is quite a challenge, but look, we are in a crisis, not the pandemic crisis, but the climate crisis that is focusing our minds on what can be done. I'm trained as an architect and as an urban planner, and I know from my professional activity in those fora that we can get to near zero buildings quite quickly. And really what's the obstacles are very clear. Sometimes they're knowledge, sometimes they're finance, but I think now is an amazing time to push forward with the renovation agenda. So many of us have spent so much time at home over the last 2 months, and I think there is quite an enthusiasm all around Europe for this project going forward.
Thank you, Karen. Indeed, I'm happy to hear that you're an architect as well, because I believe that this is a great background also when it comes to taking the needs of the people that we want to transition actually in this process. So great to hear this. Richard, you're the managing director of Places for People. So you are creating places for people.
So we're with Managing Director of Castle Edinvar. We're one of the subsidiaries of the group. We own about 70,000 properties, manage about 200,000. Our bid in Scotland is about 10% of that. But I suppose I'm the pragmatist in the room. We are the ones that are the asset owners, the investors, the have to do the deals with the finance people, and have to try and find solutions to meet our regulatory requirements. We're quite well positioned in Scotland because the government has legislated around some of the improvements required in social housing. That makes us, that sets criteria we have to meet. And then I think the reason we're in the room is that within our organisation, we've got some really kind of go for it people who we've trialled most technologies. We've actually gone fairly large scale with a number of technologies, which not only tackle the issue of carbon, but also tackle the issues of fuel poverty, equity, inequality, and these issues as well. So it's a multiple agenda that we're on. And I suppose I could bring in that element of how do you actually do it, and how do you actually pay for it, and how do you actually recover those costs over time.
Indeed. So I'm gonna provide a bit of a background when it comes to the objectives that we should consider for the renovation wave, based on our studies and so on. 75% of buildings are heated with fossil energy. A large share of buildings in existence today will still be here in 2050, obviously. In consequence, renovating them in time will be essential for a decarbonized building sector by 2050. The heating buildings was responsible for 20% of the final energy demand and 14% of CO2 emissions. And the background of this discussion is also based on the fact that the European Commission has recognized the importance of buildings for a decarbonized Europe by announcing the renovation wave as a key initiative in the EU Green Deal. And this is the challenge of decarbonizing the building stock that is requiring dedicated and ambitious people in the policy and in the economy. So that's why we have you all three here. I would like to start by asking CIARAN, considering that the report that you're doing is very ambitious today and very solid, what is a good outcome in the end? Where can you compromise, and where do you think are red lines that need to be kept, maintaining an ambitious initiative? And what are the most important items that you would like to see reflected in the renovation wave once it is published later this year?
Gosh, that really cuts to the heart of the discussion. It really does. Look, this report, it's a short report that I produced. And as we speak, it's been discussed by the shadow rapporteurs from the other political groupings. When I set out to write this report, I said, look, this is a golden opportunity, not just to tackle climate change, but to reduce the heating bills for people in their homes, but also to tackle energy poverty around Europe. And I think I see this as a fantastic way to maybe tackle three important issues. I think we need to be very ambitious. And I'm saying in the report that we need to rack up the energy standards as time goes on. If we look to the past, over the last 30 years, every 5 or 10 years, the member states and indeed the European Union has tightened the screw on the regulatory standards. I think we need to keep doing that. But obviously there are different views across the political spectrum on this. And quite often people say, this is too cumbersome, this is too challenging to achieve, let's pull back a little bit. You can see that in the rows we have as to whether the passive house standard is the way forward at a European level, or indeed within member states. Some argue yes, some argue no. I think there will be different arguments in different countries. Maybe a discussion about rooftop solar will be very much to the fore in the southern member states that have high levels of sunshine. Maybe issues around treble glazing, window technologies, or indeed heat pump technologies will be at the heart of the discussion in Northern Europe. It's hard to know where all that detail will be. But I guess coming from an environmental background in politics, I will be pushing for decarbonization very quickly. And I guess some of the pragmatists will be saying, you're going too fast, too quickly. And that's the kind of discussions we're having at the moment.
Thank you. Going fast during these times, I think it's what we need to do. But we need to go together, right? Marjolaine, you will eventually have to work with the proposals from Europe. Are you following the development of the initiative report and the renovation wave already now? Do you think both initiatives could learn from the national situation in France?
Sound was cut off. Sorry. Of course, I'm following up on what's happening in Europe on those subjects, and of course, I think Europe could benefit from France, not because it's France, but because they can benefit from every experiment made all over Europe. I think we should try and see that as a two-way street. It really should be. We shouldn't only be waiting for European policies to come down or on countries pushing up towards Europe. It should be really constantly going up and down together, and maybe that's a glimpse of the conversation you heard just before we started. I think that's really the way to work. For example, I'm trying to see how the financing of a building renovation is made in Slovenia, and I thought that could be something we could learn from in France, and maybe in some other parts France can be also helpful in some of the things we did. For example, we've tried and simplify our system of subsidies, and it's doing pretty well. And also we've had a lot of successes with our €1 heat pump offer, and it's also working very well. And maybe these are the kind of things we can learn from each other. It's really something we could be working on together more closely, because I think the links between national levels and European levels are still too slow to interact. And I think we shouldn't be shy. And nowadays we've seen that we can have video conferences all over Europe in a minute. And maybe that's something we can learn from the period we've just suffered, being at home, all of us, to be on our computers. Maybe something good can come out of it.
I'm positive that this is an opportunity. Richard, what about you? Are you concerned with policy making on the national and EU level, or are you more a policy taker that will have to work with what is eventually transposed?
I mean, we're always interested in and want to influence. I think that has to be our main goal. I think it helps the sector, both the institutional landlords, be it social landlords or be it institutional investors, as well as house builders, if there is really clear rules. And really clear rules means it's a level playing field. And if you're then seeking investment from pension funds or equity investors, everybody is seeking investment against the same set of rules. So it really does help to have an ambitious and very clear rules that apply to everybody. And that's where a European approach, because actually funding is European, funding is global, but also within nations, a consistent approach within nations, because there's that mobility of access to capital and mobility of where people will invest. And if it's easier to invest over here because the regulations are lighter, then people will take their money there. So there is a genuine need for good, solid policy making that can work. And just in terms of the types of policies, I think that you can set those really ambitious targets, but quite often we miss them. And so what's the roadmap to that? And how do we hybrid what we've got and utilize what we have to the maximum efficiency to get where we're going, recognizing that getting where we're going actually will be quite challenging, particularly for some of our 50, 100, 150, 200-year-old properties and buildings. So absolute policy takers, but want to influence the policy to make sure it's a level playing field for everybody.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm happy that Thomas is with us now.
Yes, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi, Thomas.
I would say you just continue.
We were quickly discussing the connection, the national, what I was calling the European national and local connection. So I think, Thomas, you can take it from here.
No, I assume I just came in with a coffee, and I will just.
Really?
Well, maybe I can jump back on that question again and say that it's also important to see how it works for the different countries, because we don't have the same energy mix and we don't have the same levels of energy or the carbon problem as the same way. For example, you mentioned the numbers for Europe. It is 36% of total carbon emissions, the building sector, and 40% of energy consumption. But for France, it's 45% of energy consumption, but only 25% or 24% of total carbon emissions. So it's not exactly the same. And it has to do with our energy mix. And maybe also we need to try and see how that works together. For example, we are nowadays discussing the DPE. I don't know how you say that in English. It's the evaluating of the stock, you know, from A to scale, and the numbers behind those scales. And in those scales, we have a very technical issue that is also influenced by European policies, and it's having us in a lot of problems trying to understand that, whereas actually because it takes into account the type of energy that is used for heating inside that scale, whereas actually we are targeting a good envelope for the building and not the type of energy system that is used. So difficult to enter into such a technical question here with us today, but it's something that is technically problematic in France, and apparently it's imposed by kind of a few things at the European scale. So it's important that we work together and that we make sure that some things that are technically interesting or for most of people will not block some countries in their transition elsewhere. So that's something I just wanted to add. But otherwise, we all solve the problem together everywhere in Europe with imagined solutions, and if we put our heads together, I think we have it. We know how to solve the puzzle, I think.
Yeah, I think the point you make around the devil is in the detail, absolutely really important that we understand how things like energy performance certificates are done, and actually sometimes these technical rules don't encourage innovation, because a new product getting into those technical documents and being qualifying to meet those requirements, and it has to go through all this checking, can take so long that actually those startup technologies, those innovations can be lost because they're not going to get the funding they require. And so accelerating technology is got to be part of this agenda. If that's something that can happen at the European level, where there is an acceleration of technology, perhaps rather than an acceleration of the rules, because rules take time to go through the diligence and everything else, then that's something I think that we can all learn from. But it also requires people like us who own properties to do the same as well and feed it up. So it's got to be both ways.
Yeah, Richard, I agree with you on that. And also the point you made earlier about the need for certainty as an asset owner. And if you have more certainty from the laws that we pass in Europe, it can allow you to chart a roadmap over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, we know that a deep renovation generally only happens once in a generation. So we need to prepare for that and prepare for where we want to be by 2050. But Marjolaine, you also made an interesting point that the energy sources vary around Europe. For instance, in Ireland, we have a lot of wind, and that gives us a lot of green electricity, but it varies, it's intermittent. So I'm thinking a lot about energy storage, or about how buildings can act to store that energy. So I think we see not only different energy sources and variability around Europe, you then have the complexity of different building typologies. So it is, as we say in academia, a wicked problem. But I think the solution that suits a high-rise social housing block in Estonia might be very different from a single house in the Portuguese countryside. So that's challenging at a European level. But I think within the report on the renovation wave, we're saying we have to be adaptable to all these different countries, the different regulations and different building typologies. So the detailed amendments will try and tackle that, but we are trying to give a guidebook that will help every country, every building owner, everybody living in a precarious position in a drafty, leaky home. And hopefully that will help release the funding that's required to get us to net zero by 2050.
Can we look at this data situation a little bit? Because Kieran, you said we are making a guidebook, and Marjolaine, you said there is a difference between European data, averages, emission values, and so on. And I know even different data than you mentioned. It doesn't matter what they are really. What I find typically is that we do not have enough information on how energy is used in the building sector in the different member states, how much CO2 it is emitting, and which opportunities are there. Is the initiative report of the European Commission taking that into consideration? Are you maybe even collecting this information so that it becomes available to the likes of Marjolaine and her colleagues on the national level, so that we can make a better comparison and maybe also learn from each other from what has worked in one country may very well work in another one?
I think we are working with the existing sources of data, Tomas. Clearly, if we had stronger country by country data across the EU, it would better inform us in our work. Some countries are doing better in that regard. Some are faring poorly. But I guess speed is of the essence. This report has already been discussed over and back with the European Commission. It will hopefully formally be approved by the Energy Committee of the Parliament in July and get the final stamp of approval by the Parliament in the autumn. Simultaneously, we're seeing the announcement of not just the multi-annual financial framework of €1,000 billion, we're seeing an additional €750 billion in the recovery plan. And I think the political battle is to make sure that that funding is released this autumn to help member states with their work on this. Of course, we'd like to have more data, and we do talk about the need for good data, but I don't think we'll be setting up a new system for assembling that information across the European Union.
And there is currently, or there is in the Energy Efficiency Directive, the need for a comprehensive assessment. We had a meeting with the Commission this morning on exactly that topic. And I would ask that question to both of you. Are you informed about that? Is that something where you could also talk about states? And Marjolaine, likewise, are you aware that France is obliged to provide a comprehensive assessment on the heating sector to the European Commission? So actually, both things could integrate quite nicely as we speak, because this is the time frame that we have when the data has to be delivered.
I know of an obligation to give some feedback to the European Commission, but I didn't have in mind especially the heating system only, but mostly the question of data is a problem also in our level in France. So we are nowadays working on a French observatory where we could gather all data on building renovation, and it's been created, that observatory, almost a year ago now, and it's still not giving up the data that we need. It's actually a complex question. Gathering that data and sharing it is it would only be simple if we had it. So that's also a problem. We can't be too harsh on the European Union with this data when we don't have it ourselves.
Yeah, it's true, but it's whenever you go to Europe, they will say, okay, this will have to come from the member states. We can only put the umbrella above.
And we're pushing forward to having it. It's important that we have it, and we are working on that. But it's actually the data comes from a lot of different places, and to gather it up and make it work in a simple way, and so that it's also comparable from one member state to another, is something even different. I think what Europe could work on is, as you mentioned earlier, Richard, is to have clear targets on what's need to be done, to leave room for innovation as for each country and businesses to how it should be achieved. That's also something we've been working on in one of the laws that Emmanuel Macron was very keen on having, was to free innovation in the building sector. Yeah. And so we try and tear out 2 pages out of 3 on the construction book of rules, you know.
Yeah. So I think that you're absolutely right. It's there are some quite brave decisions that can be made by politicians, because funding and capital is it's a challenge. You've got hospitals to build, you've got schools to build, you've got roads to build, and effectively then how do you invest in new technology to which is at risk, or solutions that are at risk? Because you're right, the data is something that is quite hard to access. So you've almost got to take that leap of faith that this is the right thing to do. We were very lucky that the Scottish government ran a programme, and we secured £3.5 million for which we matched with our external investments. So we ended up with a £7 million project to install heat batteries. Kieran, your point about home storage technology, and we installed these in about 1,000 properties, and we did it. It was a Scottish company, so it was a Scottish innovation. It's now a global company. Now, the heat batteries, when we installed them, there were only 12 and installed globally. So we were working with a product that was still being made in a laboratory setting. And we went and we worked with them through the £7 million project to go to full commercial scale. So they went from being this small to, you know, this big, because they're still a small player in a massive global market of heat storage. But what we were able to do is we took a leap of faith, because we didn't know if it would work. But what we did when we took that leap of faith is we built in redundancy. We left the existing system there, recognizing that we needed a hybrid to be able to, before we went to full electric only or full heat storage model. So yeah, there was a brave step taken by the Scottish government to invest in that. Our board had to be brave to take that risk around what we were going to do within our assets, and our customers had to be brave to say, yes, do that in my home, because it was a new technology that wasn't proven. So all across, we almost need to not just shift the policy landscape and the funding landscape, we need to encourage people to take some appropriate risks and be brave in some of the decision making, because otherwise we won't learn and we won't get enough adoption of technology.
Is that taken into consideration on the policy level? I think this is a very important point. You mentioned that you are a policy taker in the end, Richard, but I guess you also have some requirements where you would say, if I would find some de-risking facility in this, that would make my life so much easier. Do you have that on the European level and on the French level? Both of you, CIARAN and Marjolaine?
I think that issue of risk is a fascinating one. And I think traditionally in the construction sector, people are cautious. You might have 1% experimental, 5% innovative, and 95% conventional as a rule of thumb. And yet, with the climate challenge, we need to move much more quickly. So I think if we can reduce the risk in doing so, it can really help. Sometimes international funding, European Investment Bank funding can help with this. And we will see more innovative types of funding being made available. So I'd hope that would reduce risk going forward. But I can sense from Richard how careful you have to be with this. You don't want to go down a dead end in terms of technology, and any assistance that can be given from the state, whether it be internationally or locally or nationally, can help. And I think the role of the European Union is to try and bundle together funding possibilities to make it easier to bring about the strong decarbonisation that we need in the coming years.
And I think you're both right and what I'm hearing, and I think the built fabric first is always the question, because actually you do have different built fabric right across France and right across Europe alone, so that built fabric is really the first step, and it helps significantly to new technology. If your heat load is the same requirement, it sort of nullifies the point, really, that you're trying to reduce heat demand in homes by improving the built fabric, which makes it safer, a better place to live, and everything else first. So I think that also has to be part of the mix, and not just the energy demand load within every single property has to be a priority as well.
Well, you made it a statement, creating inspirational places for people on your website, Richard. I think, and maybe we can pick on that briefly. The building is one thing, but is the idea of having a livable space something that is also taken into consideration in the current piece of legislation? I know, CIARAN, that you worked on the City Council of Dublin, actually working on making the city more cyclable, more livable, more walkable. It's a different part, a different angle on the topic. But in the end, if we have streets that have trees, then the trees create cold, and then we need less cooling in buildings. It doesn't occur immediately that this is connected, but it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the quality of external space, I think, is crucial to the success of developments. And we know from surveys that have been done that it also increases the value of property, whether it be residential or commercial property. Everybody's talking about placemaking these days. Everyone's talking about the public realm, and we're seeing quite dramatic transformations to improve walking and cycling over the last weeks and months all around Europe. I think the trick is to embed that in policy going forward, because there is such a strong link between our buildings and the environment around them and the way we travel. Even with the COVID pandemic, we're seeing more cases in areas with high levels of air pollution. A lot of that pollution is coming from transport. So transforming the spaces around our buildings, as well as the interiors of those buildings and the indoor air quality, I think they're inextricably linked. And particularly with the renovation wave, we're looking at how to make those connections. It could be the possibility of plugging in a vehicle to your building and having your home future-proofed for new forms of mobility. It could be using shading, as you say. in Central Europe to lower temperatures in the summer, although that's rarely a problem in Ireland and possibly in Scotland as well, as Richard and I would know. People often joke about a few degrees of an increased temperature as being a good thing. But I know I was in Brussels last summer and we saw the highest temperatures we'd ever seen in Brussels. So I'm acutely aware of the importance of those external issues like tree planting to dampen down temperature extremes.
Yes.
I agree with that we need to stop with the way we are looking at all those subjects in little boxes that are aligned but never connecting. Our society rewards and encourages specialization, but the problem with specialization is that you know more and more about less and less until you know everything of nothing at all. The problem is that we need to keep connecting. For example, it was a revelation in France with the Yellow Vest movement that building renovation could at the same time work towards helping people meet the end of their month and help them win the fight against the end of the world. You know, it's the two ideas that they were crushing together with the Yellow Vest movement, was that some people were looking at the end of the month and the other were fighting for against the end of the world. And they were irreconcilable at that time, or it seemed so. And they realized, oh, building renovation can at the same time help you with your meeting the end of the month demands and just your budgets, and at the same time it helped with the environment. And now we've got this new crisis that no one expected either, the coronavirus crisis. And now people are realizing that the building renovation sector can at the same time help you live a healthy life inside of your building, because we spend 90% and those days 100% of our time inside the buildings, and we've realized that buildings make us sick and that we need to work on that problem. There are more and more studies piling up to prove that point, and we still are talking about the environment and the energy on one side and not the problem of health inside the buildings, whereas both subjects are linked. And also we are now working on how can we help with the economy and to relaunch the economy in Europe now. But we have a saying in France that is quand le bâtiment va, tout va. So when it's going well for the building sector, everything's going well. That's an old saying, but it's true, because it helps with local businesses everywhere, and it gives jobs to plenty of people all around and very local people. So it helps rebuild the economy from the start. So now if you add up everything, building renovation helps with the environment, it helps with the social side of having to pay your bills, and it helps with the health problems, and it helps with as I said just a minute ago, it helps with almost everything. €1 you put in that subject is 5 times back. You get your money back 5 times. So those things we should and could be pushing forward better if we could just see the size of investment in those subjects. The thing is, we all are looking at our budgets in 1 year. For example, you have a Eurofound study that says that if we cured inadequate housing all through Europe, well, of course it would cost billions, but you would get those billions back within 18 months. And the problem is that we put our budgets in 1 year, so we can never solve that problem if we can't see if we can't implement within our budgets the question of preventing issues that are coming, or if we can't see and implement in our budgets the return on our investments, we can never solve the problem of our environment, I think. So that's something that Europe could help us on. How can we change the way we are looking at our budgets everywhere?
I have 5 questions from this, but I see that Kieran wants to answer, and I think Richard must answer on this one, because it's getting really, we're getting down to the point, I think, of what is the challenge of all of this. So Kieran, please, and I note my questions here.
Well, Marjolaine, you put it so eloquently, those who are struggling to get to the end of the month and those who are trying to save the world, and the renovation wave can tackle all of them. One of the political battles that we will have in the compilation of this report is, what emphasis do we put on low-income housing? I would argue that tackling energy poverty can be a key early win. It is the low-hanging fruit, because often low-income housing, it's the same typology. You can bundle up 3 or 4 projects into a €50 million envelope, and that's where perhaps the European Investment Bank or other innovative forms of finance can come in. There's pension funds, semi-state pension funds that love to have the clear return of renovation, of the renovation wave. There's credit unions, there's other instruments available. So I am pushing strongly that we really tackle those suffering from energy poverty, living in social housing at the moment, as the low-hanging fruit. Hopefully that will come out of this, and certainly those organizations that are tackling housing and homelessness around Europe are suggesting that we do so. But I can see how some countries are saying, well, look, it's not that big a problem for us, but I think it needs to be. And hopefully we will see early action in that sector. And it's a place where the state, through local authorities and national governments, can really put in place dedicated policies that make this happen quite quickly.
Richard, does it make sense economically to be environmentally friendly?
Absolutely, and I think the point, Marjolaine, you make around that whole life cycle cost of a project or a building is absolutely vital, because you might not see the benefit of some of the decisions we make today in financial terms and everything until later. But also, Kieran, I think you're right that, and it makes me think there's the fuel poverty absolutely is one of these issues that seems to be a sticky issue. We don't get down below a certain figure in nations where fuel poverty is an issue, and it's an issue in any colder nation in Europe, which is certainly an issue in the UK and in Scotland. And actually, until you take fuel, having to heat your home, why is that not a basic human right, for example? And actually, there's been a lot of conversations going around in relation to COVID around universal basic income and how we make sure that there is a foundation for people in society. Well, should heat and hot water, which is a fundamental requirement in living a successful and life, not be part of that equation? And if that was then a responsibility of society to provide that universal heat and hot water requirement, governments would pretty quickly accelerate innovation, because they would want to reduce their cost burden. They'd want to be reducing the impact on them of that policy choice. And it's almost thinking about how the governments can take control of some of this, and therefore it's in their interest to then get the investment going and everything else. Because if you rely on, we're well placed as a well-run, well-funded landlord, but so much home ownership is distributed that actually, you think about 60% of people live in their own home. In the UK, I think it's around about 60% own their home. That's a massive distribution of responsibility. And so how do you take that responsibility centrally? And some of these are quite radical policies. So I'm not saying, but they're the ones that you sort of think, well, flip it around the other way, so that you're not distributing this policy challenge back out to a very dispersed. And some have mortgages, some own their property, some have assets but have no cash. It's how can you do it in a different way? Oh, Kieran, you're on mute. Sorry.
And I think what's very important in all of that is the trigger points when a property changes lease or changes ownership. there's also, Richard, as you point out, there is a real challenge. We have a lot of accidental landlords, accidental owners out there who maybe don't have the capacity to think about these broader issues of renovation. But there is that moment when a lease changes or the ownership changes where we need to get to the leaseholder or the building owner and say, now is the time to be a little bit more ambitious in renovating your property. And I think that is one of the challenges over the next few years in the work we're doing.
We have a few questions on this economics of the energy transition. There is one by Alexandra here saying that we want to be decarbonized by 2050, but how do we bridge the time in between? And I think that connects quite nicely to the Gilets jaunes. You said that there is people fighting against the end of the world and other people fighting until the end of the month. And we know also, Kieran, and I guess Richard, you have the same impression. We know that energy efficiency is not paying off if you don't take a total cost of ownership position, a long-term position. So if it's only your immediate, the end of the month, if that's your goal, and maybe the end of the year, then you never have enough money to finance an investment that is paying off over 20 years. How is that taken into consideration? And Marjolaine, I think I would ask you in specifically, can this message that you have, that we can combine the two, be one of the messages that you transport to Europe? Because we hear very often in Brussels, we can't do more, we can't do quick because Gilets jaunes. You know, the Gilets jaunes is now the counterpoint of every ambition that you may ever have. Because they will destroy Schuman, they will destroy the Berlaymont, whatever they will do. And we know the French, they come with tractors.
Yeah, sorry about the Gilets jaunes, because indeed
it's a very important thing, because it's so important in the discussion now.
English at Brexit, we have the Gilets jaunes. Those are cautionary tales for everyone else, and it shouldn't be. Because afterwards we discussed a lot of things with the Gilets jaunes, and what they said is that mostly they agree with the transition and swift transition, but they want a just transition. They say they need to be taken into account into what they can and cannot do. So we have to make it a social transition, as you perfectly stated in the title of your webinar. We need to absolutely address the question of social justice at the same time as we are discussing environmental transitions, because apparently that's the 50% of the richest cause 10% of the richest cause 50% of the changes, and the 50% of the less wealthy only cause 10%. So it's totally unequivalent, and they also need to be taken into account in that respect. We also all talk about sobriety these days, consuming less, but consuming less when you don't consume anything is an insult. So that's the problem. You can't push the message forward that you all need to make efforts. Some people do not need to make efforts. They need to access consumption a little bit, and that's something while others try and reduce their own impact on environment. So we in France have focused a lot of our help and recentered most of our helps really towards those who do not have enough to do themselves and do not have the budget to do so. And so the helps that we had are now centered towards the most needy, I would say. And so it's working. It's actually working and working well. A lot of people are accessing renovation for €1 now in Europe, in France, and that is something that is really happening. And so that works. So we need the problems that we are facing nowadays. Is not access for people who don't have any money for renovation. It's having the people to do the renovation and have the right people to do them. So we are absolutely working on training more installers so that the installations are well made, because that's a problem, because the demand exploded and it was difficult to follow up on that demand and with a proper offer. And so offer of people to do the renovation and offer of the right products, because it's also a strain on the industry to have such an important demand coming up all at once. And I know you know that, Thomas, because it was discussed last time you were in France discussing the heat pump systems. So that's the challenge.
How about Europe? How is that in Europe? Kieran, we have a precaution in the Renewable Energy Directive that says we should have educated installers. There is already for 10 years an idea that every country should train installers to make them capable, to skill them, to be able to install renewable energy solutions. And perceived, at least, little has happened. Will you pick this up, this report?
We do, and one of the subheadings within the report is skills and standards. And we see that there is a huge role to upskill construction workers to handle the new challenges that are out there. You know, in the UK and Ireland, it's easy to talk about the old days of feet and inches and the new days of meters and millimeters. And I think the construction sector is going from a very hands-on, rough and ready approach to a very technically skilled and highly competent area. And that transition from physical skills and strength to technical skills does require upskilling for all of us, whether we're professionals or whether we're manual laborers. And I think there is a need in each member state to improve the competency. That means education programs, certification programs, and bringing people on that journey, whether they're an 18-year-old going to an apprenticeship or whether they're 50 years old trying to learn the new skills of what a deep retrofit is like.
Go ahead. And then after, can I ask the question directly to Richard after Marjolaine? Do you find enough skilled labor to execute your renovation projects? But Marjolaine first, please.
Sorry to cut line to Richard. I just wanted to say that most of our subsidies today go towards helping people buy technical things like really systems, technological systems, and it's very difficult to finance people, training people or counseling. And we need to, maybe that's something also Europe could help with, to have a program specialized really not only for global problems with renovation systems, but a program that is only focusing on training and counseling, because those are the hardest things to finance, because you do not have direct, as grounded return on investment capacities. So it's more difficult to finance it. And I think it's a problem not only in France. So maybe that's something we could.
I think you're both absolutely right. It's a really interesting angle, actually, that and it's a good question to get into, because we do face that challenge of retraining an entire workforce around new technology. And our experience is it's the, dare I say, writing ourselves all off. It's the younger generation of engineers who are coming through and actually teaching their peers, and who are often older than them, who've been around for a while, around the new technology and how simple it is to plug and play different pieces. At the same time, as people are building new technology, it's building new technology that is plug and play as well. So there is, you're right, it's the biggest resource we have is our people. And if every time you have a plumbing engineer or a heating engineer or someone who deals with the building fabric, replacing windows and roofs, a roofer, if they're saying, actually, I can repair that roof, but did you know you could be doing this? And you could do this, and this is how long it would take. Those conversations, having those conversations will start things happening. So yeah, there's a massive opportunity to make the workforce that's out there today, and it's a big workforce across Europe, on new build sites, on retrofit, give them the opportunity to become the ambassadors of this change is a much more bottom-up approach than people like me or like us saying, how do we do this through our lens? What's their lens, and how do we get them to be the owner of this? Because they're smart people. They just need the tools.
I think then we need to briefly touch upon the cost, because as I said, it is still a problem that today, if there is no support, if member states, if a country is not as brave as France, merging all the support schemes to allow for €1 renovation, then we quite often face the situation that either you have a distressed purchase, so your boiler breaks in September when you switch it on for the first time, you need immediately, or you perceive the need to immediately replace it. The installer comes by and says, okay, like for like replacement. What do you have here? 32 kilowatt oil. We just put the same in. I have one on shelf, and tomorrow afternoon you're back in the business. And then we have no time to plan for a proper renovation. And you mentioned it, Richard and Kieran too. We get access to the building maybe once in a generation. And so the demand at the moment is not necessarily pointing into the direction of having a renewable energy system. Mm-hmm. How do you plan to change that? It's a continuous discussion that we should get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, but they're still there in many countries. Taxation of electricity versus fossil energy is still there. We are approaching it a little bit here and there, but the short-term investment decision, I think, gives still an advantage to a fossil fuel solution.
I think it does, and I think there's a wider issue of weaning Europe over those fossil fuel subsidies, and we see them all over the place in agriculture, in energy, in transport, and elsewhere. I guess within the narrow bandwidth of the renovation wave, I'm suggesting that we need integrated renovation programs at a local level, and we also need one-stop shops. So we almost need a shop front where you can go in, get the information about how to renovate, be pleasantly surprised by the return on investment, and get the technical assistance on how to move forward. Because I think often the resistance to change in society is based on a lack of communicating the benefits of those changes. It's not necessarily that the money is going elsewhere. And we've seen in compiling this report, we've seen initiatives such as the Energy Sprong in the Netherlands, the New Green Saving Initiative in the Czech Republic, and we've district renovation schemes in Lithuania that have worked well at providing the funding for renovations at a local level. So there's good examples from around Europe that we can look to. I mean, we can put our hands up and say, all the money is going elsewhere, or we can look at what's actually working in Europe. And there's some great projects that are doing wonderful things at the moment, and I think we can learn from them.
Absolutely, I agree with that. It's really important not to try and say that one country has one solution that would work for everyone. That wouldn't be, I think, very pragmatic. And but at the same time, in our project, what works is that we can now offer €1 renovation for isolating roofs or floors. We can have €1 for changing an old inadequate heating system. So those are all kind of renovation that you can do for €1 these days. But the problem that we are facing with is that it encourages a step-by-step approach instead of a global approach. And so what we are trying now to do is how to try and get the €1 offer for a global renovation and for a deep renovation, because the €1 thing has maybe slowed down the global system. So we are now trying to implement €1 for everything, so that it's ready for zero carbon, zero energy buildings now, so that it helps the the professionals work together in this kind of coordinated approach, because that's still difficult. But people are still looking for heat is one problem, isolating is another problem, and so on and so forth. So the idea is try and figure out programs, maybe for those who really can't afford it, and to fight inadequate housing, and push forward €1 global programs, so that it can serve as the place where you can learn for professionals how to coordinate well in a program. So it's at the same time solving the inadequate housing issue, and at the same time a training program for the professionals to work together, if you want. So that's something we are working on these days, and I am very hoping it's going to happen in the next few months in France. So
this is relating very nicely to one of the questions that we have here. What about a wider approach when it comes to zoning and connecting different users of energy, different users of heating and cooling? Is that considered? Is that considered maybe also from the likes of you, Richard? When you start a new development, do you look for waste heat sources that you could make use of and actually supply heat to your buildings easier than just producing it yourself?
Yeah,
data centers, factories.
At the larger scale, that's certainly been part of the planning agenda. So you need the scale, probably in the thousands of units, to get that type of technology to work in the current environment. And I think there's also something in this around there's an awful lot of behind and in front of the meter solutions. There are also technology solutions that are about better modeling and management of energy grids that also can come into this, because it's not all just about what we do in your homes. We currently supply energy in a very archaic way in the UK, particularly through pipe networks and everything else, and the inefficiencies in that are enormous. So how are we going to also improve what's the onus on the owners of the grid networks to improve the efficiencies of that combined? Is it worth the grid network putting an energy storage, heat or electric energy storage battery into every home because of the requirements on them to manage the grid better? Whereas at the moment, all the onus again is on the owner rather than the infrastructure owner of the grid. So I think bringing them into this play as well is really important. I can see Kieran's probably was had a comment on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that storage device is the car that you're plugging in to your home every evening. And perhaps you're in a contract that allows 20% of that energy in the car to be taken out to help balance the grid. I think there's a lot more possibilities for synergies between residential and industrial developments. I look out my window at the Guinness factory and I see them venting off waste steam where there's people living in energy poverty right beside them. And I think not just in existing developments, but in new developments, the data centers that are allowing this webinar to take place, I think so many server farms aren't capturing the waste heat. And there's huge possibilities for transferring that heat to residential developments. We're piloting that in South Dublin County Council at the moment, but I think there's potential for that all over Europe to scoop up that waste heat and use it efficiently in the surrounding neighborhoods.
Very, very interesting. We're coming pretty much to the end of this webinar. I think we could probably go on for a very long time, and we would always find something new. We haven't touched upon indoor air quality too much. We haven't touched. We could do more about these one-stop shops. I'm very happy to say that we will have a separate webinar next week on exactly that, mass-scale industrial-style renovation, where we have the German branch of Energiestrong, and as well Paul, so it's Christian Fichtner and Paul Kenny from Tipperary Energy Agency, both very prominent figures in this mass renovation approach. And I hope that we can collect all this information and hope also that we find some of these solutions back in the reports that are coming from Europe to the member states and to the legislation takers, such as you, Richard, but also back up. I think it's important that we find these solutions and connect them on a higher level so that it becomes easier to become ambitious. I would like to give you the floor for a closing remark. All of you, what would be your wish if we want to decarbonize the building sector? What if you could get one thing that would just be given to you? What would need to be done?
Well,
No, go ahead, Karen.
Okay, from my perspective, I think we will see significant amounts of money going into the sector over the coming months and years. But it's no use having a wheelbarrow full of money if you don't have a good plan for how you're going to use that. And I think we do need a stronger regulatory framework to make sure that we don't spend the money on the wrong things. The European Court of Auditors looked at renovation funding in 4 European countries, and they expressed significant concerns about how the money was spent. So I think we need a better framework at a European level for how to use the money that will be forthcoming for the renovation wave.
I note that down. Marjolaine.
What I would say, because I thought of that in advance, I was writing up my wish list to Karen so that he would pass it on. But I think I would like Europe to help us throw bridges between the subjects of health in the buildings and energy and environment in the building. We need to have a few programs to link them together so that research can give us data, so that industries can work on those problems together. So I think that would be really important, because we are still too, as I said, separated in our little boxes, and that would be a huge help. Also, I would really like you to help us work on the way we can take into account the idea of investing in our budgets and having a return, even though that return is only in 2, 3, 5 years. How can we inscribe that in our budget? For example, taking the ecological spending out of the 3% deficit required by European treaties, that would be something, because it is a problem when we are trying to limit the deficit, and that is only normal in all other subjects. But with the question of environment, it's a question of investment. So we have also to be able to go further if we want to, and it shouldn't be held up against us doing it. Also, I would like Europe to work on helping out carbon capture, and not only punishing or helping out carbon reduction, carbon emission, but we need to work also on carbon capture. And this, I think, is an issue that hasn't been much helped. And I don't think that reduction only will do the trick. We also need to know how we can capture it. And I think they are now trying to innovate on concrete capturing carbon inside the walls of the buildings. And apparently it's working. And this could become possible, but with a little help, financial help, to make it work. And so far, it isn't a business that can happen without any help. So that's also something else. I would say.
Never three. That's too many. We have to.
I don't care. He's here. I'm taking advantage. Not forget the importance of training professionals and counseling people. Yeah. These should be financed as well, and not only technical solutions. And maybe try and have a scale of targets between now and 2050. Because the problem of only the zero carbon, zero energy in 2050 is too far ahead, so, for us to see it in a closer way. So maybe implement I don't know, targets for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So that's all. But that's already a lot.
Thank you, Marjolaine. I really got what I asked for. You present the ambition that I like to see in this whole development, and Karen also. Richard,
thank you.
Okay, mine's going to be very quick actually, because I started quite cheekily saying that I'd be the pragmatist in the room, but actually it's really positive. I think both Kieran and Marjolaine, you are both very pragmatic politicians doing what we're trying to do on the ground. So I suppose my request is influence your peers as much as you can. And there are others like you out there, and I know you know that as well. I'll do the most to influence my peers. And I think if we can all get everybody to start owning this, then actually some of the solutions will find themselves. It just will, because of the collective will of the group of people getting behind it.
This is a very good closing remark. I will not add anything to it. I thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And I hope that we can jointly push the button a bit forward with ambition towards the decarbonized heating sector, maybe much earlier than 2050. Thank you for your contribution and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
You take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.